Okay, we are ready to go whenever you all are.
Hey, all, sorry. Give me 1 second to get ready.
Yeah, no worries at all.
I think we're still waiting on a judge too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think McKay's not here yet.
Gotcha. Counting is never my strong suit, so thank you.
Berkeley, you're an app in this debate, right?
Yes, Berkeley's off.
Okay, cool.
Are all of the judges here and or ready to go? I just saw that another person had entered the room, so I wasn't sure if we could get started.
Yeah, I might have been last. Sorry, I'm here.
Okay. In that case, if everyone is ready, then let's begin. Anyone not ready? Okay. Framework 1 is that the individual can construct as part of a historical trajectory of progress rooted in reproductive futurism. The 8 is that reproductive futurism refers to the way in which society is physically structured around the child to achieve a better future, maintain the social order devised by the figure of the child. We are necessarily beholden to future generations. The B is that the queer is constructed to be attached to the pursuit for closure of reproduction, sexual acts performed by same-sex couples. This is why the Pope calls same students a caricature that, quote, has a future, cannot give future to any society. The C is that the future is constructed without the queer. Society is a project of assimilating formerly deep queer identities into its sphere. What's that?
I'm sorry, I just said slow.
Oh, okay, for sure. Society is a project of assimilating formerly deviant queer identities into its figure of conformity, eradicating them for their non-conformity. Examples of this are mass police killings of trans women of color because they refuse to be captured within the figure. Transnormativity tomorrow literally doesn't exist for the queer. Therefore, the judge should evaluate the round through the frame of the present. We must talk about the queer. And now the D point is it's a prior question. Subjectivity comes before epistemology, ontology, ideology, etc. Because all of these presume that there exists some subject that generates these processes in the first place. For example, questions like what am I or how do I come to gain knowledge are flawed because they posit that there exists already an I that exists as a prior question. The asking of these questions too is that futurism imposes an ideological limit on discourse and by rendering alternative mindsets is against life and progress and therefore unthinkable. The A is that debaters are trained to think within teleological futures and look to apocalyptic link scenarios and policy apps or utopian also critical debates. A classroom is where we are produced as good social citizens and enlisted for the preservation of the social order, which means that our challenge to the debate space is uniquely key. The B is that fairness is an illusion to keep us invested in progress and meritocracy, that if we follow the rules and work hard, we can claim a good life for ourselves and future generations. The C is that impacts about alternative methodologies potentially providing benefits in the future are non-responsive for the oppressed. The future is never promised, which means that the validation of our methodology is a more urgent priority. Third is that there's not even any point in trying to be futuristic because none of our predictions come true. The A is that narrative constructions of the future are impossible because none of us have access to the information that will shape the world. Rather, attempts at constructing a future serve to sustain the symbolic order. This is how early slavery rebellions of the U.S. by Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner have been incorporated into the official narrative of slavery abolition. The B point is that even experts can't predict the future. Philip Tetlock asked more than 300 experts to make forecasts about real-world outcomes, but expert predictions barely be random guesses, proving no better than a dirt throwing chimp. The C point is that every action has infinite consequences. Every effect on an action produces another to infinity. There's no bright line for which all effects have been accounted, and a finite comparison of impacts can occur. Rather, every action is equally good or bad under futurism. D is circular logic. They're based on the validity of experience. For example, we know the sun will rise tomorrow because it has in the past, but the validity of experience itself is unproven. The only reason we know that experience is a good guide for future action is because of the experience itself, which is a circular justification. The E point is that you will argue that some individuals have the capacity to make predictions about the immediate future, such as the pen hitting the table when dropped, but that's not responsive. We're not saying that the literal future isn't real, but rather that the symbolic representation of the future is skewed, and that any macroscopic political predictions oriented around such will be skewed by the ideology of progress. Thus, the role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best challenges the ideology of futurism. The role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best challenges the ideology of futurism. The harms. One is homonormativity. The A point is deviance, the forced assimilation of formerly deviant identities into normalized modes of life. Denies queerness by eradicating difference. Look at how marriage equality and adoption rights are ways to conform queer lifestyles to heteronormativity. This creates a condition of bare life in which value to life only exists so long as you are contributing to the historical trajectory endorsed by the state. The B point is endless violence. The ideology of progress creates an impossible endless crusade to assimilate or punish deviants or other excluded identities in an effort to extinguish different supercharging instances of oppression until all populations are disposable. This is why over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the 20th century, including immigrants, black people, indigenous people, and poor whites, but mostly black women. And forced sterilization continues to recent day in prison. The C point is that we obey the social orders. This extends is predicated on endless and total violence. So it's triad for the affirmative. It also means we control global uniqueness on how civil society constructs violence, and we outweigh on time for the magnitude. The D point is that we're the most proximate cause to the recent rise of white nationalism in the United States and the increased killings of black, indigenous, people of color, fear of being overrun by immigrants and people of color underlies the white fear of being out-reproduced and mandate that America must quote-unquote go back to its formerly white teleology. Second is intelligibility. The A point is that conceptions of the self within the state are structured as discrete ontologically true identity categories which are organized in terms of their contribution to societal developments in a way that decontextualizes people from the others and the past so as to facilitate their co-option for the expansion of certain branches of power. Intelligibility functions as a tool assisting the power to identify population's location within this trajectory of progress. The B point is biopolitical surveillance. The construction of identities serves to maintain the social order and neutralize oppression. The power of biopolitical democracies and unending move towards intelligibility and the creation of new identities to be surveilled. Look to the inclusion of citizenship status in the 2020 census, which attempts to make bodies intelligible in order to better control them. The C point is pinkwashing. The assimilation and normalization of queer identities allow the subjectivities to be co-opted and weaponized in order to create states of objection and engage in genocide. This is how Israel markets the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as cosmopolitan gay vacation spots, which actively invisibilizes ongoing genocide against the Palestinians. D is homonationalism. Subject formation is a prior question to engage in structural issues. Else, bad understandings of subjectivity lead to the co-option of one's own subjectivity by systems of power. Homonationalism refers to the processes by which settler colonial nations like the United States weaponize their quote-unquote progressive treatment of intelligible queer identities as a justification for continual violence against cultures that are deemed to be less progressive, which explains violence such as the forced westernization of Islamic cultures. Third is root cause of oppression. In order for some individuals to be defended in the name of their inherent humanity, there must be some identity deemed to be the non-human. It is not just that some humans are treated as humans and others are dehumanized. It is rather that dehumanization becomes a condition for the reduction of the human in the first place. Look to how second-wave feminism activates trans individuals and people of color who fell outside of their ideal understanding of womanhood. The advocacy The USFG should enact HR 2570, Climate Risk Disclosure Act of 2021, express solvency. One is that queerness is not an act of being or becoming. It goes beyond the binaries of pleasure and pain. The grounding is the unnameable remainder called jouissance, which is the pure bliss of the now is the love of the moment. Queerness offers the epitome of jouissance, an act of no pursuing purpose except for the queer. Now, without any necessary reproductive value, we look to the embracement of queers who ignore the very real threat of sodomy laws to embrace their partners. It is this act of anti-futurism that we subscribe to. Two is that we affirm the resolution as an act of jouissance, a metaphorical dice that confounds historians who attempt to linearize and make intelligible the trajectory of the queer. We refuse to predict the outcome, prescribe action, or propose a specific alternative. Instead, we open ourselves to the multiplicity of temporalities. It offers us maybe nothing or everything will happen. We will accept it without condition. In doing so, we deconstruct teleological conceptions of futurity by recognizing the innumerable possibilities afforded to us by any given action. Third is that jouissance solves the A point is that it destabilizes the self-revealing paradigm of futurism by undermining the logic of cis securitization. Under jouissance, the future does not exist, just the here and now. Any rejection of the resolution would only define us in opposition to the norm, but any proposal of a specific action to be taken would situate us within it. We instead embrace the third option situated in the here and now. The B point is that by engaging in jouissance, we break down the dichotomy of pain, pleasure, good, evil, positivity, negation, etc. This dissolves these finite and binaristic congealments of identity that allow us to know and survive as ourselves. For queerness can never describe an identity, it can only ever disturb one. The fourth argument is that the only tangible effect of the ballot is to endorse an approach towards the judge's own subjectivity. Any movement building paradigms oriented around the ballot are doomed to fail. The A point is that your only capacity as a judge is to reorient your own understanding towards subjectivity. The B point is that movement success will always be constrained by the ideology of progress. To the human rights campaign, cutting the trans community out of its movement and prioritizing marriage equality and adoption rights in order to appear more politically valid. C is dogmatism. A study earlier this year from USC psychologists found that counter evidence only reifies existing beliefs. All beliefs stem from perspectives of challenging subject formations a precondition for change. 5 is that a true endorsement of a dice rule does not include multiple throws. The A point is that an attempt to improve upon a previous role is a signifier that one is not truly embracing fate but trying time and time again to improve upon it, re-entrenching a commitment to futurism. B is that jouissance is the element of queerness that cannot be locked up in an industry. Any compromise, any modification is a negation to its spontaneity. 6 is that the act should always get a perm. The A point is dogmatism. We should be able to incorporate multiple possibilities, including the permutation is an effort to destroy difference. The B point is that the law of non-contradiction is violent and a part of Western metaphysics. The idea that you must be either A or B, but nothing in between excludes difference. C is particularisms. Even if our general method might be bad, there might be particular exceptions where our F is good. So, but F.
Sorry, y'all. Can we get the text, please? Cool. Okay, and then you just said the advocacy was the res. Okay, cool.
Yeah, sorry, I just put it in the chat.
Yeah, no worries. Starting now. Okay, it's gonna be 2 off, and then the case in the order that it was read. Cool. Is anybody not ready? First is the T on enact definition. Enact means to make a bill or another proposal into law. Again, enact means to make a bill or other proposal into law. The violation is that they don't meet. They are only offering, basically advocating for joint response. They don't indicate how Congress would actually enforce the bill. This would be effects and extra topicality, which illegitimate violations should be rejected because the prima facie burden of the affirmative has not been met. The standard sufficiency limits, the most precise limits is best because it allows us to come to a better understanding of words and the resolution that by creating a better debate. But these points in field context, we would indicate that, actually, no, never mind. D is going to be voters. The first going to be a priori for fairness education. We would indicate that the rules of the game outside, this is a rule of the game, but also never being to how top police the collapse debate, which is bad. We'd also indicate that. Yeah. Next off is going to be framework. The interpretation, the affirmative may only derive offense from the defensive hypothetical implications of a topical field plain text read in the PMC. Again, the affirmative may only derive offense from the defensive hypothetical implications of a topical field plain text read in the PMC. The violation, the ones that the should calls for policy action by the United States federal government. Also, this extra topicality, they don't defend the field implications of the resolution advocacy, rather impacts garnered outside of it. These standards first can be field is good. Field is an act of imagination where we envision the world as it is now and thus are capable of evaluating whether the resulting would be good or bad. This allows us to reconceptualize levels of power to empower marginalized folks, but also allows us to conceive a future that's better for marginalized people from our perspective, subjecting positions of privilege and also people of color are constructive powerless. Not only our interpretation allows for recognition of how microforms of advocacy can mobilize towards agency over macro level systems. The second is going to be decision making. Critical imagination PI is key to considering the material consequences of radical action. All decisions are material, which means materiality is a prior question. The understanding our subjectivity interacts with the topic, generates empathy outside of ourselves, and enables us to understand how policy implicates our internal relationships. Keep us solving the app. This also means that we turn the app. The be some points that our subjectivity is always already implicated by the state, and the state is going to be inevitable. This third is going to be give up the bad. Our interpretation prevents the judge from being the arbiter of subjectivity and balance. The judge is required to witness the performance of both teams without leaving early, requiring them to authorize or erase people's identities if they have been brought into the room. The fourth is going to be truth testing. The affirmative presents itself as a truism while simultaneously refusing the rules. In this instance, defending the resolution, making it impossible to test the method or arguments of the app. The five is going to be switch side debate. The ability to be negative on the topic and choose a different method is always opting the negative, which means their interpretation is already solved in half the time, and thus is not competitive to ours. The vote is the first going to be a priority, needs to know the games before we play the game. The second is going to be substantive engagement. The app excuse evaluation does not can't know if the claims are true, if we can't effectively test them, and the legitimacy returns the app. Advocacy being perceived as unfair means people don't endorse or join the movement. This is especially true when we can't control for the fairness outside the round, which means in-round education should be preserved. The third is going to be education. Little a is that portable skills are necessary, otherwise we just learn how to win more debates, and this also turns the app because leveraging policy skills is the only way to implement the app ideology in the real world. And the fourth is going to be evaluating through competing interpretations. Reusability allows them to ignore the standards debate and results in judge intervention. This also means that they shouldn't be able to leverage the app onto the T. The next on the framework specifically, the first that this actually kills collective politics. Little a is that no future symptoms are equally destructive of communal politics. Element the emphasis on particularity, primary narcissism, and essential private communing demonstrate this, but also the second is going to be co-optation. The K will be co-opted by the right wing and abandoning queer community to immediate social violence. But the third is going to be Jose Esteban Munoz. The little a is that refusing the future as a white bourgeoisie fantasy. It imagines a queer subject abstracted in a multitude of oppressions that mark everyday life. But also we must reposition queerness as the desire for another way of being to queer. The future not abandon it, but sees that their method acts in direct contradistinction to Edelman and critiques how the child is a white. Is this still true? Yeah. How the child is a white construct that abstracts the matrices of oppression that people of color face. But before is that focusing on the future is good. The only way that channels the oppressive structures your impacts insolvency act in the future, where you dismantle politics with B's and B. It's not deterministic, focused on reproductive futures and allows it to be reflexive of the past, the present as well. The five is understanding that sexual reproduction is the core of politics is just wrong. You treat reactionary movement as the norm, which reverse decades of cultural change in the ways that queer politics are root cause, focusing on reproductive futurism can't explain queer oppression, family life, consumerism, mass culture, or religion. But the Beast Boys accepting the multiple intersections underscores the necessity of working through the political institutions to achieve change. And the sixth is failure to evaluate responsibility for the future denies any collective social change, i.e. we don't understand the racial relationships between our actions of each other, which means that you never get collective social change. But the seventh is that futurity is also key to new social orders that are less oppressive and necessary to alter the current social order. But specifically, I want you to go to this idea about fairness, equally meritocracy. This is only true in a world in which you are emphasizing the idea of policies. We would indicate that when there might be fairness that doesn't exist outside of this round, it is also critical for us to make sure that fairness can exist within the round to some extent. We would indicate that rejecting the topic is not fair because it then destroys the stable locus of the debate. You have to ask yourself, what would a negative team then have to be engaging in if they don't understand your method, or if they don't have access to things like other critiques or alternatives, or the same theoretical literature to combat this type of to combat this type of narrative. And also, we would indicate that this isn't just circular logic. We would isolate why the ability to actually transform our these theoretical concepts within policy allows us to actually make real change in the real world. We also indicate that if this is circular logic, then the judge should just be voting for the negative anyways because you are just rejecting the topic. We would indicate that that's why you should just vote negative to negate. But on the roll of the ballot, they talk about challenging the ideology of futurism. We would indicate that not only would you be able to do what do you want to say on this?
Just cross-apply your earlier pieces of offense that you read about reasons as to why futurity is necessarily good?
Yeah, we would indicate that futurity is necessary good. You can cross-play the articulations here about why not only is queer politics the not a root cause, but also accepting multiple intersections under underscores the necessity of working through political institutions to achieve change. We'd also indicate that this is
It's also inevitable they practice futurity.
Yeah, it's also inevitable they practice futurity, which is probably another reason that you can just be voting negative on presumption. But we'd also indicate that if you have to eradicate all forms of futurism, then you would literally be eradicating the self. We'd also indicate that yeah, cool. Next. They talk about intelligibility. We would say that intelligibility goes out the window in a world in which there isn't like equal access to like a topic, which means that the theory should probably also come first here. We would indicate that especially the ideas about deconceptualizing others. If it's true that individuals already have like fluidity in their identities, and this means that you can never deconceptualize fully, which means it's about access in the space. But we'd also indicate the ideas of pain washing. If you can't engage in social collective actionism, then pain washing always becomes inevitable and is a way in which genocide then becomes justified. We'd also indicate that on these things of homo nationalism, this is the same. We would indicate that futurism would be critical to resolving that, and especially if it's inevitable, you should probably understand how the state operates and how you'd be able to translate these kinds of arguments into like state language, so thus so you can get collective movement in the long run. Next on the advocacy. The first is they say to basically do the affirmative. There's no implications as to why they're demonstrating the material implications of the plan, which indications why they'd be violating on both the T shell but also the framework. Secondly, is you can just vote to negate again. Vote negative negate if it's true that this act of Joyce is able to rupture the like differences or recognize the differences. This means that the neg should be able to have access to this multidisciplinary construct. We'd also indicate that there's no indication why doing this on the app would particularly resolve. You just talk about the state being bad, but when we've already indicated why the state's going to be inevitable, Joyce should also be resolving for the idea of the negative. But this also has two implications. One, it means that if you if Joyce really isn't bidirectional and the negative can't just basically vote negative negate because of Joyce, that means you probably don't have solvency because you can't actually engage people in your movement, which means you should also just be voting negative on presumption because it means that they don't have solvency. But also, this means that they would be able to resolve all the options of the K if you just vote negative negate, because if Joyce also has to recognize the other, then you can also recognize us recognizing the other. That is the app, which is why you can just vote negative negate. We'd also indicate that this idea about indiscrepancy and destroying difference, if it is true that you can just vote negative negate, or if this gives you access to the perm, then we should also be able to get access to just simply negating, because it means that we no longer would be different. So thus the perm wouldn't function because you could just be voting neg to do the app. Next, they talk about these things about a priori that they have to like approve. Like, what do you understand this a priori argument?
It's just like their considerations come prior because they like affirm. Actually, answer Joyce wants first and then get to that.
Yeah. So did we have those?
Oh yeah, the like death drive arguments.
So Joyce Hans actually comes from the death drive, which means it's always about trying to eliminate suffering. We would indicate that would always in terms of the same harms that it creates, which is an indication to why it probably wouldn't be able to resolve on that instance either. We would say that futurity will always be better for resolving these issues because you end up doing social collective activity.
Can we get the texts?
Yeah.
And that's it. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, 2 minutes starting now. What's the status of this sort of like vote neg to negate thing?
We're like not defending it as like its own advocacy or position. That's just like a piece of argument, offense arguing about how the affirmative, you don't need to affirm to, like, you don't need to have an affirmative ballot to affirm what you said.
Is it futurist to vote neg to negate?
Yeah, we'd also say that the advocacy arguing that you should affirm to like affirm your harms is also a form of futurism.
Okay, I get that we're futurism, but is voting neg to negate futurism?
I mean, probably voting to do anything is probably futurist.
prompt me. You need to. Awesome. Let's see. Perfect. Just pull up. Perfect. Okay. Awesome. We are going to go on the AF, and then we're going to do the framework T-sheet, and then we're going to do the intro, right? Perfect. Awesome. If we're all ready to go, beginning. Now start on top of the framework one, extend the reproductive future zone structures the entire social order, including debate by a narrative history, always moving in the direction of progress and criticism, obstacle that future societies either constantly assimilating formerly deviant queer identities into its figure of conformity or eradicating them like the police killings of Black trans women. To the careers constructed as the epitome of destiny. Tomorrow's never promised for the career terminal solves its deficit, and a reason why you have to include the F in order to solve. 3, you can see that subjectivity is a prior question to everything because it frames out who we consider valuable in our impact calculus, means the analysis, 4, futures impose an ideological limit on arguments we introduced in the flow in the first place, excuse evaluation claim that function on the same level as your framework can also impact transportable skills because debate just makes us soldiers for an anti-queer social order. But you can see that fairness is a meritocracy myth when linked back into anti-queer futurism and is a justification for eradicating unproductive populations that don't follow the rules. This is also an impact turn to T. 6, extend that futurism fails. A, it takes out your futurism good impact turns, even if there's some benefit to the future in the abstract, it's impossible to get there. B, takes out it takes out T. It would be impossible for us to defend traditional advantages because those rely on predictions means your model of debate is bad and uneducational. Harms 1, extend that deviance framing is a mechanism of violence. Terminal solvency deficit, the queer body will still be framed as non-productive and therefore worthy of eradication or just inclusion by exclusion. 2, you can see the overkill blockers mean we control global uniqueness in a social order definitionally predicated on the eradication of queer subjectivity. A single moment without doing the F is a moment of total and endless violence. This is a net benefit to the perm. Advocacy 1, extend that affirming the resolution as a metaphorical dice rolls and actors or sons of pure bliss now that denies the value of reproduction. 2, break down dichotomies of identity via unintelligibility. 3, extend that movement building paradigms are badly linked to ideology of progress and justify trans overkill. This impact transportable skills and fairness methods offense. 4, you can see the dogmatism part, that's not important, but 5, dice rolls can't have multiple throws. This takes out a vote neg. CP and vote neg do the AF spikes in the perm.
It's uniquely more futurist because it's an attempt to improve upon the role that is the AF.
It's uniquely more futurist because it's an attempt to improve on the world that is the AF. But then specifically on the K, first they tell you that that the state will always co-opt your movement, co-opt the movement, but realize that the root cause of this co-option is futurism, right? The state is always trying to reincorporate narratives into the official state narrative because of futurism. That's where we're going to turn it, and we won't. There's also no impact. Yeah, there's also no impact. Then they tell you that. They tell you that the figure of the child is like a white concept, but realize that this reading of Edelman is not the reading that we use. We say that deviance framing is the root cause of violence because it frames who gets to be human, and because there are people who are humanized, that means that there must be a population that is dehumanized. We're not and we tell you that this is the most proximal cause to white nationalism because we deem who is dehumanized and who is humanized. But
the Edelman bad author indicts are not responsive to our reading of Edelman.
They're not responsive to our reading of Edelman. But then group all of the policy making good and movements fail stuff. Realize that any movement that is created without the AF will just cut out communities to seem more politically valid. Look to how the human rights campaign cut the trans community out of its movement. So all movements will inevitably fail without the AF because they will all just cut out key communities. But to realize that any of these movements that happen with the AF will just be re-entrenched into the state because the state will always co-opt these narratives and reincorporate them back into the state. But then they tell you that we only create reactionary movements, but realize that the root cause of reactionary movements is reproductive futurism. Look to the Human Rights Campaign warrant. But then they tell you that it denies collective social change, just cross-apply. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you're good.
Okay, on specifically to the futurism good stuff. Realize that they've dropped the A and the E point specifically if the predictions fail, where we tell you that 1, the state is just going to reincorporate your narratives of future, and the fact that we are not specifically indicting the future as a concept, but when movements use make predictions of the future, that's specifically bad. They tell you that queerness is not the root cause. We tell you that not specifically queerness, but the way that deviance framing is used is the root cause. Then they tell you that the future is inevitable. Just cross-apply the fact that yes, the future is inevitable, but movements don't have to make predictions based on the future. And then they tell you that we eradicate the self, but just cross-apply the E point about movements, not individuals.
They say eradicating all futurism is an eradication of the self. There's no warrant.
Yeah, there's no warrant there. But then move on to the harms. Just realize that this lacks. Let's go on to that last page. Just realize that all of their responses on the framework are non-unique because queer violence is the quo. But then on the harms page specifically, realize that Oh,
Their
this
answers
just
to intelligibility are just reasons T come first, but they beg the question of why intelligibility is being read in the first place. State policymaking is inaccessible.
Yeah, realize that state policymaking is inaccessible. That's why they're not impacted T. And then this stuff about futurism just cross apply.
That's
This
fine. Go to
stuff
the
on T.
advocacy.
Go to the advocacy. Also realize they tell that we're not material, which is a violation to T, but realize that the homonationalism warrant is a way that this spills over into materialist benefits. Then they tell you to do the vote neg CP. Realize that you don't get multiple throws, and an attempt to do the vote neg CP is just an attempt to approve upon the AF, which is in and of itself very futurist, so that's going to be on net bad. But then they tell you that if response is not bidirectional, it has no solvency, but realize that one, your movements fail without the AF, and two, the vote neg CP is futurist. And then they tell that JoJo is a form of the death drive. Realize there's no warrant, and two, that's not a reading specifically of Edelman, so it doesn't apply.
Go to T.
Go to T. Awesome. On T, counterinterpretation, the AF can derive offense from affirming the resolution as an actor's response to your inter plus our AF. Standards 1 solves your offense because we only get to allow for just one AF. 2, our AF is the net benefit, so we get to wait against T. 3, reciprocity, you get to access to representational offense by a case, so we should 2 or we lose every round. 4, bad CPs, if we defend the resolution in its entirety, you would read really abusive picks and we would win every round. 5, round, you can go for turns or RBIs in the AF. 6, limits, if we're bound to defend the AF throughout the entire round. If we weren't, we could have just kicked the AF and restarted the debate with MG theory, which is really, really bad because it outweighs on golden answers. But then, on the top of T, IVA framework T is the ideological tool of the ideological hegemony project tries to assimilate AFs that reject futurism in order to make them conform to traditional policymaking. This also means that T is a link to the AF, so the AF comes first, drops the debater to defer for their abuse. 2, we mean our advocacy text is literally the res. We're not driving any offense outside of affirming the topic. We defend the post-payout implications. All we've done is read a bunch of framing for why the affirming the res solves more than just traditional nuke war impacts. A, all Fs would be extra T under your inter because they all derive often from affirming the, things like impact framing. So framing like policymaking is good. But yeah, then they tell you that fiat is good, but
the AF is an impact turn to this because it's reasons why engagement in the state and the future is good.
Yeah, okay. The AF's an impact turn to this fiat good stuff because they tell you reasons why state is good in the future, but we tell you that this is specifically bad. But 2, they tell you that decision making is good, but we tell you that all decision making will be tainted by reproductive futurism under the AF. 3, they tell you that the state is inevitable. We say that we're not trying to deal within the state, we're just trying to rupture the futurism that allows the state to surveil queer bodies and do queer violence. But 4, they tell you that truisms is bad. We tell you that we are not forcing you to debate truisms because we are simply a method and you have the right to test that method. And
to switch sides debate.
Yeah, 5, switch sides debate. Just remember that we literally cannot do this without affirming the resolution because we have to affirm something to do with joy silence on the voters. 1, fairness, we impact fairness because it keeps us invested in meritocracy. 2, there's no fairness anyway because of resource disparities and answers to skews the value. Your theory of fairness skews the values because the round can never be perffully fair. But judges are answers to truth testing. 1 leads authenticity testing and 2
the other inter.
Okay, onto the other inter. On the counter interpretation, we can do the resolution. Standards 1, it's the most stable locus because it's literally the resolution. And 2, limits, we could pick to enact any sort of different policy and just create new policies, which is going to be independently bad. On the we literally pass this bill into law, so we are enacting the bill, which is literally what they tell us to do. And then you can turn limits because if we had
to specify a way of enforcing, that's unlimited.
Yeah, if we had to spec a way of enforcing, that would be unlimited. We could use literally any bureaucratic agency possible, which is going to explode limits for the neg, so we're going to be on net better for the neg, thus affirm.
Can we get the counterinterp for the framework and for the T?
Here are the ones for framework. I'll write the one for T now.
Cool, thank you.
The order is going to be a brief overview, then the medium or the framework of the negative, and then the T before going to the case straight down. Is anyone not ready? The affirmative mishandles a bunch of offense on the affirmative, which is a reason as to why affirming the resolution as an act of jouissance is never going to resolve for the harms that they isolate. And also, their answers on the T also mishandled our exact interpretation of exactly what we mean by enact and exactly what we mean by defending impacts of an act of Congress. Specifically on the medium form framework, I want you to drop down to the IVI really quick. They say that we're a form of ideological purity trying to impose traditional policymaking. A couple of responses. First, the reading of the framework is just a test of whether or not the affirmative should have been read in the first place, which means that if we agree that your reading of the affirmative is sufficient for us to be able to engage with you in the first place, that we're not boxing you into traditional policymaking to begin with. We're just testing what is the best model of debate. But also, they say that the reading of the framework is a link into the affirmative because of the boxing into a specific type of defense of the state in the future. However, they've conceded arguments on the affirmative, which I'll get to later, about how futurity is necessarily inevitable, which means that all of these arguments about how we're trying to defend the state in the future, improve the state upon in the future by forcing them to defend traditional policymaking are moot because this form of futurity is always going to be inevitable. They have not contextualized these arguments to state futurity in particular. But also the next thing I want you to look at is this argument talking about how they're not telling us to debate truisms, but rather methods. We'll be winning reasons as to why your method is necessarily bad, and also because of the way that you have decided to defend the resolution to begin with has resulted in us losing education in this debate. They've also said that they impact her in fairness. Even if that's true, it doesn't matter in a world where your education is uniquely bad because it doesn't connect back to the exact form of enact that we're talking about. And also they say that their form of education would necessarily be able to resolve for disparities. I'll be reading answers on the affirmative specifically as to why this is not the case. Also, is there anything else?
They just talk about extra T, but you can weigh FX here.
Oh yeah, they also talk about extra topicality doesn't necessarily matter. However, we can weigh FXT in this situation, but also we would say that extra T is also bad because of reasons that we'll talk about on the T. Anything else? No. That means you can extend across their counter-interpretation that the affirmative can derive offense from affirming the resolution as an act of jouissance will be winning reasons as to why you shouldn't vote affirmative just because of that on the T. The first thing I want you to do is extend across our definition that enact means to make a bill or proposal into law. It has to be a bill. In particular, we have the articulations on the violation specifically that they don't meet this because of their specific defense of the impacts are not connected to that the passage of the act or enactment of a bill in the first place. They're not connected to a action by Congress, which is indications to how all of their solvency and impact analysis have nothing to do with enacting or passing a bill into law. This is the very specific articulation that Tierra has on the violation, which is a reason why they are not meeting our definition in the first place. Their counter-interpretation also is not competitive with ours. They say that the act can defend the whole resolution. Cool. That's not responsive to the violation articulation that your impacts and your defense of the solvency of the advocacy are not connected to the enactment of the bill. They're just an affirmation in using jouissance. Yes.
And even if they say the effect is homonationalism, you didn't answer FXT and then just.
Oh yeah. Also, they wait, what?
Basically, they say that they affect
Oh yeah. Also, they also say on this sheet specifically that they're able to affect homonationalism, but this is another reason as to why your effects are topical because you were trying to take extra steps to resolve for homonationalism generally speaking, which means that you definitely violate this effects and extra T, which is the second argument on the violation here. Next, let's go to the standards. I want you to extend across limits. That's the one you read, right? I want you to extend across limits that the most precise limits is best because it enables us to understand individual words in the resolution and thereby have a better debate. We say this has two implications. One on education. We say that even in a world where fairness is dubious, it doesn't matter because they've conceded arguments about how if it's still important to preserve any type of fairness to any extent within the debate space, and structural unfairness exists outside of this round. But also we would say that this is still going to impact the quality of our education because in a world where we don't have a stable locus or imprecise limit on what can be considered enactment in the first place and what impacts can be garnered from enactment in the first place. That means that we don't have an understanding or clash that would result in actual truth testing of their arguments in the first place. Let's go to the we meet that was read after all of this. They said that they meet because they passed the bill into law. Once again, the advocacy is the only time that the bill is ever breathed in the PMC. You should hold this we meet to a very high threshold of being able to prove that this enactment directly results in their resolution of the harms, in their resolution of the impacts, and in their solvency. Not a single word in the solvency mentions climate risk disclosure.
Yeah. Also, the only method is jouissance, which means it's not a literal act of
Yeah,
Congress.
yeah, and also their method, which they have defended throughout their answers on their framework, is focused on jouissance, which is an indication as to how this is not focused on enactment by an act of Congress, but rather on an affirmation through jouissance. Anything else?
Which means it's them as actors.
Yeah, which means it's them as actors and the judge as an endorsement of this particular method, not as the actual enactment of the law. Let's go to the voters. You can extend across the A prior for fairness in education, but specifically we're going to be focusing on education, but you can still be pulling across these arguments about how any extent of fairness, procedural fairness is going to really matter in a world where structural unfairness already exists for people in color and marginalized folks outside of this round, but also you should extend across the rules of the game. If there are no, if you only adhere to certain rules of the game but break other rules, and that's just, that just allows you to, that's the same logic that allows people to subvert their own legal sovereignty. It's the very same way that the state is able to create these deviancy narratives in the first place, which turns the affirmative. But also you can extend across this argument about how never being topical leads to the collapse of debate, which is bad. We say this is going to have two implications for your for the reading of the affirmative. First, if you if you lead to the collapse of debate, that means that there's no ability for you to read your affirmative in the first place, which means that people don't join your movement and people don't understand what jouissance is to begin with. But also we say that the second implication is that when not being topical leading to the collapse of debate means that your method is never tested, which means that we never know whether or not your method is a good thing in the first place. We'd say that this is an indication as to how if there was no ability for substantive engagement by the negative, that means that we don't know if their truth claims are true, which means you should just defer to the negative on presumption. Anything else?
I think you can just get to this idea of that social order stuff that they try to leverage.
What was that?
The social order, basically, like everything's in a social order, so debate is implicated.
Oh yeah. They say that debate is part of the social order, and that they would be able to resolve for these deviancy narratives that are part of the social order. But we will be winning arguments on the AF as to why this is not the case. Let's go to the AF. I want to tangle with some of these case arguments that Tiara brought up in the last speech. First, the first argument against this by the affirmative is that the root cause is futurity, which is the one that kills collective politics. However, we state that no future as a concept in and of itself is precisely the root cause of this, because it's destructive of communal politics, and Edelman's emphasis on particularity and primary narcissism is precisely what results in the breakage of these coalitions. Their response to this is that they're not that their reading of Edelman is different from our understanding of Edelman, but that's like literally another link into their own criticism, because they're once again creating distinctions between what is their version of Edelman and what our understanding of Edelman necessarily is. This is what Munoz's understanding of Edelman necessarily is, that leads to the breakage of coalitions between marginalized populations, which is always going to turn advocacy, the solvency of the advocacy. Also, we would say if the affirmative is always able to say that that's not our form of Edelman or that's not our form of jouissance, then it's impossible for anyone to join their movement, which means that they have no advocacy solvency because we don't know what the hell they are. But also, the next argument here is about how any reading of the affirmative fixes these deviancy narratives. However, once again, we're indicting your understanding of these deviancy narratives in the first place. You can extend across all of the Munoz warrants, which specifically talk about how repositioning queerness as a desire for another way of being to queer the future, not abandon it, is precisely what we'll be able to resolve for the harms, not your advocacy. This is a misunderstanding by Edelman that does not include the consideration of people of color and queer people of color. But also, you can extend across the fact that on this argument about how predictions always fail, it doesn't matter because you've conceded that futurity is inevitable. When futurity is inevitable, it's only a question of being able to queer the future, not completely denied to begin with. Let's go to the alternative. That means you can extend across all of the no solvencies that Tiara made, but specifically the vote next to negate, because we don't know why affirming would be able to resolve in the first place.
Okay. The order is going to be an overview. It's going to be the affirmative, and then it's going to be T. Okay, this one. Okay. Is anybody not ready? You'll be voting for the negative from Pacific in today's debate because we are 2 ahead on the T sheet. That indicates that education in this round has been skewed, but also that when procedural fairness doesn't exist within this round, it's important to preserve what fairness does exist, but also that if the method of the affirmative can never resolve not even itself, it's not even a risk to vote for the affirmative when you could just be voting negative on the T. But this also implicates all of the articulations on T, specifically about why the affirmative would have to come first. Rashida does a good job weighing these in the speech, specifically about if there's no solvency to the AF, you can just vote negative in 2 places. One One is on the T, but secondly is on voting negative to negate. I want you to go to the case now. She does a good job articulating why futurism, if it's going to be inevitable in any form, symbolic or practical, means that the K wouldn't be able to resolve itself. This has implications in the fact that it would mean that all of the things that they say would just re-entrench themselves, which means their harms would be inevitable, which means on probability and time frame we're just ahead. But also they drop case terms which indicate Munoz has said that this would just lead to infighting. The same distinctions that they make in the MG is the same distinctions that Munoz critiques about how that it just pushes out people of color, but also people that don't necessarily fit with their movement. This is the same understanding of their distinctions between Edelman. This outweighs not only on probability because it's been happening this round, but also on time frame because it means you don't actually get solvency because people don't join their movement. We are controlling the internal link to coalition building, which means that they don't get access to their advocacy at all. But secondly, this also means that they are going to have to extend their method of jouissance. We are winning reasons as to why jouissance as a method is going to fail, so they don't have solvency on the affirmative. But secondly, it also means that they just link harder into the enact T on the T specifically. They're probably going to try going hard for this idea of and a lot of new analysis in the MG. I mean, in the PMR, probably some PMR magic. You have to be being very careful of the flow on not buying new analysis. Only hold it to the MG analysis. Next, go to the T. Specifically, we're winning the we're winning the interpretation here. The only WeMe was not competitive. The fact that the WeMe isn't competitive means that they don't have any offense on the standards. I read all your paradigms. You want offense on the T-sheet, which means if you write a ballot that's not for Pacific in the debate, you're going to have to defend it. Secondly, we are winning a specific standard about limits. They try to say that they're better for limits because then they could choose any bill to enact. However, that doesn't coexist with the fact we've indicated what limits mean. This is the most precise limit. When you haven't defined enact in this way, it means that you are not recontextualizing enact, which means you always get to justify a method of just affirming the resolution or affirming jouissance, but you do not indicate how that is baking a bill into a law or making a proposal into the law. If anything, this also means that you can just be voting negative on the effects topicality. They're probably going to try going up here and say that they affect homonationalism, because if they don't affirm jouissance, they don't combat homonationalism. But that is literally the idea of effects T, that you are topical because of an effect of your plan. We have indicated why that leads terminally to individuals getting skewed out of debate, but also has independent offense that people no longer would join debate, which would collapse debate and terminalize the fact that you can't read your method to begin with, which means we are also ahead on probability, but also magnitude here, because if your method is so good and somehow you do get solvency, individuals wouldn't be able to get any outside of this round because they join debate. They don't join debate, but also you've conceded that your method hasn't been tested, and if it can't be tested in the debate space because we can't truth test your claims, that means your method always fails. But also this has implications for the no solves on case. Either jouissance is able to resolve and whatever, which is why you can just vote negative to negate, or jouissance can't resolve, which is why it's not a viable method, or you don't know that it can solve. We've also indicated that as a judge, if you are ever struggled within this debate between understanding the Edelman that they are and the Edelman that essentially we were critiquing, that is another indication as to why they wouldn't be able to resolve, because it would just lead to coalition infighting. That's why the cleanest route to your ballot is going to be on the education that we can get out of the T-sheet, because of how a precise limit of what it means to enact would be clear, but also it means that individuals can then join, engage further. They're probably going to try going hard for the idea of the IVI, but a couple responses. The first, that the IVI was on the framework. We've already resolved all of the offense on the framework, hold them to a high threshold and pulling any analysis from that sheet, but also we are already indicting the solvency and the of the critique, which means any kind of leverage of the critique onto the T in the first place would be one new, but also you need to hold it to a high threshold because we're winning no solvency claims.
Okay, the order is going to be a brief overview, and then the F, just to clear up the case turns debate, like F top down. And then it's going to be the T that they go for. And the way that the WeMe is articulated on the interp that they don't go for will become relevant to the way that they contextualize the violation on this interp in the MO, but I'll get there in a second. I'll signpost too. Where's my sheet? There it is. Okay. Everyone ready?
Yep.
Okay. Vote out because your case turns don't have global uniqueness at the point where you've conceded that deviancy is the status quo right now, and the eradication of deviancy controls the root cause of literally all forms of violence. Is try or die for that. Even if your case turns are 100% true, the only internalized impact of them is movement failure and anti-queer violence. But that is the scope right now, which means that if try or die, go to the app. I need to extend a couple of things or reasons why the app comes before T. Are three arguments why the app comes before T as a jurisdictional question. The first argument is that futurism imposes an ideological limit on discourse. This is extended in the MG and conceded by the block. The implication is that the app is a prior question of topicality because it's a prior question determining when is valuable in the debate space, i.e. what norms are educational, what norms are good to enforce is determined by reproductive futures, i.e. the reason why debate spaces seem to be good as because it is educational is because it contributes to a good future of the debate space and create good futures for us to preserve the social order, which means that the app is a sort of evaluative prior question to D. Second is that we're impact turning B, sort of reason why education is good in the first place. We're impact turning the terminalized impact of education, which is the sort of movement success that they talk about. They say that education is important because it's important to test the movement of the app, but the thesis of the app is that movement building paradigms are bad because they just collapse back into anti-trans violence at the point where the ideology progress allows them to sacrifice the most vulnerable members of their community in order to appear more politically valid. That's the human rights campaign warrant, which means that the app is a prior question to even achieving that movement success in the third place. First is that third is that you have conceded that you're way behind on the predictions debate. Predictions inevitably fail, especially in the context of large-scale macro political predictions, which means that we're a prior question to the sort of methodology of testing the app via topicality. Go to the line by line. On the predictions debate, we need to extend the predictions definitely fail. You've conceded the narrative constructions of the future argument, which means that even if it is the case that the future is inevitable, the state will always skew your understanding of how we get to that future, why that future is important, or what that future means in the context of large-scale political movements. The warrant is that the reason why Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner were incorporated into the official narrative of slavery abolition is because it was beneficial for the state to do so, because they construct themselves as some sort of revisionist that was able to move past a history of genocide and racism. But that was just a state narrative. The implication is that even if there is some benefit to future movements, such as queer movements that are aimed around orienting the future, or topicality, which is aimed around creating a better debate space in the future, the state will always control how those are implemented in the real world, which means that it's impossible for those movements based around the future to ever be successful. Your argument is that futurism is inevitable, but you're flowing through ink even if micro-political sort of predictions like the pen hitting the table if I drop it are inevitable. Large macro-scale political movements are not, and you have not conceded that this is the exact type of futurism that we're critiquing in the first place. Go to the case turns debate. You extend a couple of case turns that I need to answer. Now, you say that like ignoring the future is bad because that leads to like communal destruction of communal politics, but you've conceded that we already control the root cause of that because movement failure is happening right now because of reproductive futures, and the state wants to shut down movements that it deems to be in opposition to. That's in the MG that you have conceded, which means that we're ahead on the internal link. You say that Edelman is bad, but your only impact as to why Edelman is bad is because Munoz critiqued Edelman because Edelman rejects the future, but I'll deal with that when I deal with the Munoz debate. You say that our sort of shiftiness about what we're understanding as Edelman is a link back into the app because there's a distinction between like correct and incorrect interpretations of Edelman. No contextualization as to how exactly that is a link to the app. Also, we have been clear about our interpretation of Edelman since the beginning. We're not going for the sort of biologization understanding of Edelman. We're going for the understanding that the state controls what futures are seen as valuable in the first place. You say that leads to movement failure, but you're behind on the uniqueness debate here. You're on the Munoz debate. Your arguments don't have any uniqueness because the future is impossible to access in the first place, even if there is some benefit to doing so. Also, the anti-queer violence is the squirrel right now, which means that Munoz is incorrect because it's impossible to achieve the future in the first place. Just because Munoz has critiqued Edelman doesn't mean that Munoz is correct. Go to the harms. You have conceded global uniqueness arguments that say that we frame the debate space with homonormativity. Your case turns just collapse back into the status quo. We solve the biggest impact of around the advocacy. Your vote neg counterplan, you have conceded defense to it, which is that there are no multiple dice rolls. Your commitment to futurism because the state is able to co-opt you. This is in the MG, and you have conceded that the advocacy solves 100% of the harms. The app. Go to T. We're going for the we meet T. Your interpretation text is that enact means to enact a bill or other proposal into law. Look at the we meet on the other interp. We said that we fiat the resolution, we pass it into law. You can read your dissents if you want to. The way that you contextualize the we meet in the MO is that we don't meet because the way that we're implementing it is not educational. The text of your interp doesn't.
Any cross application of one we meet on one of the theory onto the other would be new in the PMR.
I mean, I'm explaining why the we meet that's on this sheet in the MG is we meet, we pass it into law. I'm like explaining what that means. I don't even need to be cross-applying from the other sheet. I'm just explaining what it means to pass into law in the context of the app. But, you know, it's a panel. All right. I have about a minute left for T. Everyone ready? Okay. You're definitely undercovering the we meet and the MO. The only way that you explain the violation is that we defend the resolution in an uneducational way, but your interpretation does not prevent us from doing so because you conceded the counter interp on the other sheet that said that we can defend the resolution as an active response, which means that your interp doesn't prevent us from defending the resolution in a way that is non-educational. Also, if we impact on education, then it doesn't matter that we're defending the interp in a non-educational way in the first place. So the we meet is gold. And finally, you said that the advocacy is the only time we mention the bill, but the only reason that's bad is because it's not educational. Your interp doesn't preclude us from doing so because it says to enact means to make a bill or proposal into law. Next, we'll go to the counter interpretation. It might not be competitive, but if you reject the we meet, then it definitely is because your interp forces us to sort of specify beyond the resolution to spec how exactly we're manifesting into law. So it's a double bind. Either we meet your interpretation because we are the whole resolution is topical, or the whole resolution is not topical. So the counter interp is
any of the arguments talking about how like the interpretation doesn't subsume those like arguments about your impacts and like your solvency being untopical or uneducational is new.
Yeah, the MO says that the counter interp is competitive. If the PMR doesn't get to answer that argument now, I don't really know when we would be able to. So Yeah, it's a panel. Finally, the only offense that you extend on the standards level debate is education, but that's incredibly problematic because the strategy of the app is that we are impact turning education. There might not be any external education offense on the counter interp, but that is a good thing because the counter interp is good because it is uneducational. We can defend the whole resolution, and that decreases the education in the round, which is good because education is heteronormative and leads to reproductive futurism in the first place, as per the analysis of the app. Finally, you talk about debate clubs, but the only terminalization of debate clubs that you read is that it means that people can't learn or engage with our movement, but we've already impacted the sort of movement building paradigm that this presumes. Good app.
Good debate, y'all. Good debate.
Good round.
Good round.